Hi, this is Nahid, and this is the first in a series of Aspyrre classes that we're going to be teaching on the Enneagram. What we're going to go over in this class is basically what is the Enneagram and give you a few basics for how it works, and then fit it into the Aspyrre program. So we'll explain to you why we like to use this tool at Aspyrre and kind of how it fits into our overall model. So what is the Enneagram? It's basically a shape. It's a diagram. It has several components. It actually has three main components. The first component is a circle, and the circle is said to represent unity. The second component is a triangle. And you'll notice with this particular tool, there are tons of threes in it. And then we have a very interesting shape, which is our third shape. And you'll notice that it's a bunch of interconnected lines, but there are a lot of threes and triangles in those lines. But this is the shape that's the Enneagram, and actually all Enne stands for is a 9-pointed diagram. So there's 9 points on this shape. Now this is a very ancient symbol. Said to have been around for about 5,000 years. Nobody knows for sure because the people that are using it now only have stories from people maybe a couple of generations back. And the person who everyone remembers discovered it in Afghanistan and maybe in some Gnostic spiritual texts. And there's tons of rumors, but nobody really knows how far back it goes. What we do know is that it wasn't used for personality until just this generation. So it wasn't, the diagram itself doesn't really mean anything about personality. It can be used and applied to a lot of different things. And what people were using it for in about the 1950s, 60s, was spiritual growth. But there was a man called Claudio Naranjo, and this is him. He's still alive. He was a psychiatrist, and he was very interested in spiritual growth. And he was a spiritual seeker from when he was a child, and he worked with all of these famous people in the spiritual world. And he also, though, got a medical degree and worked in psychology and with very famous psychology people in the world of psychology. And he was a teacher, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, which is the #1 school, the #1 graduate school in psychology. At least it has been for the past 50 years or so. So Claudio actually used the Enneagram for spiritual growth, but because he had this knowledge in personality theory and psychology, he began to map those theories onto the Enneagram. And so what he did was create what we call the Enneagram of personality types. So the Enneagram itself could be used for other things. The person who, Kirchhoff, I think, I don't know exactly how to pronounce the name, who originally found it was using it to map the stars in the universe and various different other esoteric things. But Naranjo, or Naranjo, if you're not quite sure how you pronounce it, but what he did is he used a psychology background, and he began to see how the Enneagram could map out the different personality types. And so this is a very simplified version of what he did. So remember, he was a professor up at UC Berkeley, and that was one of the leading psychological schools. Also in the 1960s, that was Haight-Ashbury and everything. That was the big spiritual movement. A lot of people were very, very interested in New Age thinking and spiritual growth, and so there were a lot more groups that were dedicated to finding themselves and learning more about spiritual pathways and spiritual journeys up in that area of the country. So he created a spiritual growth group, And the growth group was called Seekers After Truth. And this was at UC Berkeley. And in the spiritual growth group, they used a lot of different tools for spiritual growth, because the whole idea was to become present. And if you've read any spiritual growth books or read anything by Eckhart Tolle or any of the other spiritual teachers of our time, you'll know that a lot of people talk about becoming present and how important that is. Claudio would presence people. In other words, he would sit and look into their eyes and get into the state of being, of presence, and people would experience things, and that what they would experience is some spiritual connection. And so the Enneagram itself wasn't all of what he did, but it was a tool that, you know, he found the Enneagram, he worked with it with other spiritual teachers, he had this psychology background, he mapped the personality types onto the Enneagram, and it turned out to be a very useful tool, because most people found that they identified strongly with one of these personality types, and each of these personality types had a set of personality structures, including the defense mechanisms that the child developed as they grew up. And most people are very unaware of their psychological structures because we live them. They're how our mind is formed, and they point to our belief systems, and our belief systems we don't see as belief systems, we see as our truth. So if you know your Enneagram number and you begin to read what the experience is like for that number, you begin to see what parts of yourself are actually not necessarily the truth. You can begin to see what parts of yourself actually were built up as a defense mechanism or as a survival mechanism or as a set of beliefs in response to events when you were young, perhaps. So this tool was so powerful that his small group of students started using it and seeing other ways to apply it. And they began to teach it. And for example, Helen Palmer was one of the teachers, and she was so excited. She was teaching intuition at the time, and she said she was a psychotherapist, and she said there's no other bridge that I had been able to find between the spiritual growth world that's very esoteric and the psychological world. And she also maintained that you had to really understand your psychological structures. A lot of people were trying to do spiritual growth without really dealing with their personality. So she really believed that psychological growth and spiritual growth went hand in hand, and you couldn't just jump to spiritual growth. And you couldn't just do you could do psychological growth because it kind of comes on top of that. But at any rate, you couldn't really do spiritual growth without also doing psychological growth. So that's why this Enneagram is so powerful. It's a very deep tool. So how does this relate to Aspyrre? Well, if you remember, we have an Aspyrre obstacles model that I often like to call the Iceberg Model. And the whole idea, and I don't know if you can see my pointer here, because sometimes in the video we don't see it. Let's see if I can make myself a pointer. I'm going to make myself a laser pointer here, so hopefully this will show up in the video. So here is our iceberg that I'm circling with my pointer now. And the iceberg represents obstacles that you run into when you're trying to achieve a goal or something that you really care about in the world. And typically the obstacles, some of them are very visible, like you get confused, you're not really sure what to do or what steps to take. So you need a plan, or you may need some knowledge, or you might have some habits that are getting in the way. So you sort of know what to do, but then you have all these habits that go against what you're used to doing or what you want to be doing, and it takes a lot of energy for you to change your habits. And there are other things, and as we go deeper, what we find is these things are less conscious, but more holding us in patterns. And so when you feel like you're banging your head against the wall and you're really trying to move forward, but for whatever reason you're not changing, usually what you're dealing with is something way underneath the water. And what we have down underneath the water is getting your needs met, but at the very, very bottom of the iceberg, and I hope you can still see my little laser pointer here, is what we call beliefs. And so at Aspyrre, reassessing your beliefs is kind of the deepest work that we do. So if you are really, really stuck and you begin to do belief work and you begin to see what kinds of beliefs that you have that are driving the patterns in your life, and you're able to begin to reassess those beliefs and possibly change them, then your world changes, and things that used to seem like you could never make them happen start happening. And when I'm talking about beliefs, I'm talking about really deep beliefs. I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. I'm unlovable. The world is a dangerous place. I don't matter. I'm bad. I'm powerless. I'm not valuable. These are the kinds of beliefs that you find are at the very, very core of our of our personality, and we don't even see them. They're so deep underwater. So at Aspyrre, one of the things that I'm passionate about is coming up with tools that we can use to identify the beliefs that are getting in the way. If you have beliefs that aren't getting in your way, you can keep those beliefs. But if you have beliefs that are getting in your way, then you want to identify those and maybe re-look at them and reconsider them and see if they're really true or not. And then if they're not true, then you change your beliefs to something that is true. And usually that really frees you to live the life you want. So that's our process at Aspyrre and what we really care about doing here. How do you use the tool? So basically what you want to do is take the online assessment. It really only costs $12. It's not an Aspyrre assessment. I have a link on my website, though, to take you to the Enneagram Institute, where you can take the assessment for $12, which is good for as far as assessments go. But let me go backwards just for a second, because there is one thing about our little iceberg model that I didn't mention, and that is why the Enneagram helps with this. And the interesting thing is that the Enneagram tends to point to a belief system for each personality type. So if you find that you resonate with one of the Enneagram types and you begin to read about that particular number, what you end up finding is that it points to a belief system, and it may point to beliefs that you have that you never really realized you have. So that's why it's such a powerful assessment. Most assessments tell you kind of what your type is and what your personality is, but they don't go so far as to tell you what your underlying belief system is, what your psychological growth path is, and what your core psychological issues are. Now, it isn't really very scary stuff, but it's not like you have to go to therapy for 20 years to discover this stuff, but it does tell you cognitively what it is that tends to get into people's way. So back to how you use the tool, I said take the online assessment. What you want to do is read the descriptions to get clarity on what you believe your type is. So the assessment will tell you what it thinks your type is, but the assessment is spitting that back from how you respond to questions. And the interesting thing about the Enneagram is ultimately you have to decide what your number is. Nobody else can assess you. We like to try to type each other because it's fun, but the thing is the Enneagram is about our underlying motivation. It's not about our external behavior. Most assessments are about our external behavior. The Enneagram is about our internal motivation, and we may exhibit a lot of different behaviors for the same motivation. In other words, I might want to convince you of something, and there may be several different ways that I try to convince you of something. One way may be to tell you what I think. One way may be very indirectly to try to manipulate you into believing me. And one way may be to sulk long enough for you to maybe feel sorry for me and then think whatever it is I want you to think. So there's a lot of different behaviors that might show up. What the Enneagram points to is your motivation and belief systems, but not necessarily how you act out on them. So your behaviors may be somewhat consistent with the behaviors that they say are typical for each number, but your behaviors may not be consistent with that number. So even finding your Enneagram type can be a little bit of a journey. So what you want to do is, once you feel like you're pretty clear what type you are, then you get a sense for what the spiritual and personal growth journey is for your type. And then you look at your Aspyrre, your theme and your personal development goals, and you see where they line up. And what we want to do is take what you've learned from your Enneagram score or your Enneagram type and integrate that in to your theme and your goals and create practices that continue to help you move along in your personal development in a way that breaks down beliefs that don't serve you so that you can achieve your goals faster and you can see progress on your theme better. And we look for little practices, nothing big or major. If you don't like meditating, we don't want you all of a sudden meditating for an hour each day unless you're so excited about it that you will for sure do it. Small little practices that are kind of in line with what you want to do, and they don't necessarily even have to be spiritual practices, just something that's sort of in line with what you've learned about yourself. So then, because we have these weekly progress reports, you can continue to journal and discuss and check in on your progress reports every week. And when we have our calls and we talk about various things, talk about your progress and your theme, you can share what you're learning, and even the little subtle things you're learning from these practices will be great stories to share with each other. So this is the Aspyrre website, and if you look at the tools menu, you'll get a drop-down box that has a lot of great tools, and right here is the link to the Enneagram personality test, and it will take you to a page about the Enneagram with a link that takes you away from our site to the Enneagram Institute where you can purchase your test and take it. And once you get your results, we can discuss it. Now, this is only the first class in a series. There will be other classes after this one that will tell you a little bit more about the Enneagram in a deeper way. But I wanted to give you an overview of it and why it's important to get started with. So if you haven't taken the Enneagram test yet, you might want to just take it and see what comes out, because that's really a first step to all of this.